James Blake is a journalist specializing in the intersection of international security and humanitarian crises, as well as refugee and migration issues. His clients have included the International Monetary Fund, the International Rescue Committee, and he has worked with several world leaders through the Mayor's Migration Council. In addition, he has authored risk assessments on terrorism and global issues for some of the world's largest companies, including JP Morgan, Aon Insurance, and Deutsche Bank. Most recently, James alerted the international community to the humanitarian and human rights crisis as a result of US immigration policies in Central America from his fieldwork in Guatemala, El Salvador, and Mexico. Currently, under a new initiative supported by the Carnegie Corporation of New York and the Soufan Center, James is helping to showcase local news stories about the humanitarian and security effects of COVID-19 in conflict settings across the Middle East, using TruePic image verification technology to counter disinformation about the pandemic. James holds master's degrees in international relations from St. Andrews University in Scotland and in Near and Middle Eastern politics from the School of Oriental and African Studies at the University of London. He will speak today on immigration, COVID-19, and disinformation, and their impact on international security. Welcome, James, to the forum.
Thanks very much, Joanna, and thank you to both of you for agreeing to hold this event on this topical and timely conversation. I know we were meant to hold it a few months ago before the COVID-19 broke out. We were delayed, but I'm really grateful to both of you for all of you're doing to highlight the issues which very few other organizations are discussing at this time. And hopefully in the coming months, we'll get a chance to meet in person and learn more about the great work you're doing at the World Affairs Forum. So I'm grateful, obviously, for Zoom and the opportunity to hold this conversation during this time. You know, it is amazing with the technology that we have these days, that it opens up this kind of conversation to a wider audience and ensuring that we can hold these conversations during the pandemic. So thanks to everyone, and I look forward to speaking for about 20 minutes or so before opening up to questions. So I actually wanted to start my remarks by telling a pre-COVID-19 story from a recent trip to Central America. It was a conversation, in all honesty, that I will never forget. It was in late January, and I met with a recent returnee from the US border to San Salvador for a coffee in what was the late afternoon. He'd been back in San Salvador after being deported from the US for about 10 days when we met. He was about 24, and he wept periodically as he recounted the trauma of fleeing from a neighborhood gang in San Salvador, leaving his wife and child behind as he sought safety and work, which he hoped would enable him to provide financial support to them. Some of what he told me, he said he was documenting only to help others like him in the future. So these few paragraphs I'm going to say now are back, and hopefully, you know, will do his wish as well. He told me about his trips to the US border, which involved paying off a people smuggler, who in turn paid an organizational criminal gang, which would then involve driving a bus through much of Mexico. He mentioned some women who were traveling with him who had to pay fees, which included birth control, to protect them from sexual rape during the journey. He said that he was one of the lucky ones during the trip. He avoided the tragedies and abuse that many other people he was traveling with suffered from. He made it to the US border, but then he was detained. He subsequently told me about his time in a detention center, which included the near-death experience of his roommate after taking medication he was allergic to, but couldn't communicate to those in the detention center that he was allergic to because of language barriers. His case went to appeal, but after 4 months, which involved essentially the interpretation of credible fear, which is the baseline for a successful asylum application in the US, he gave in and he was deported back to San Salvador, where he told me he still fears for his and his family's life from the criminal gangs. He also didn't know how he was going to get money to support his family, given the high rate of unemployment. All I could really do for him was to give the emergency number of one of the large humanitarian organizations which I met with, and provided him with the contact details to be in touch with. As I said, this was before COVID-19, which has resulted in so much distress across the world. In the past few days, as unemployment has risen in San Salvador and across the country, people are taking to the streets and waving white flags as they ask for money to support themselves and their families from starvation and food insecurity. Moving us back to the present day, and my current assessment sitting here in New York in July 2020, is my sad assessment that the impacts of COVID-19 in fragile and conflict states are likely to be the worst catastrophe of my lifetime, and possibly even over the last century, depending on how relief efforts and humanitarian assistance plays out in the coming weeks and months. In Yemen, the world's worst humanitarian disaster, a UN-sponsored paper indicated there could be more than 200,000 deaths from COVID-19. In Syria, Idlib province, war-torn by almost a decade of conflict, has left millions fearful for their lives because of a lack of foreign aid, ongoing conflict, and a lack of hospitals, ventilators, and trained doctors. And now, over the last few days, the outbreak of COVID-19. COVID-19 outbreaks are unfortunately also having a devastating impact in places such as Zimbabwe, Somalia, and across Latin America. It is really no exaggeration to suggest governments could fall. The number of refugees and displaced persons, which is already at a record high of just below 80 million people as of the end of last year. Tens, potentially hundreds of millions of people are also likely to be pushed below the poverty line, which is defined by the World Bank as below $1.90 per day. It is also worth noting already that non-state actors, such as the so-called Islamic State and a variety of organized criminal gangs, have already started exploiting the lack of governance and assistance in many conflict-ridden countries to promote their position. This includes Hezbollah in Lebanon, which we've seen issuing various statements and attempting to win the hearts and minds of populations that it's giving aid to. It's also happening with criminal gangs in various Central American countries, as again, they provide aid and step up where there is no government to support the relief efforts. A 10th July background paper on COVID-19, which was prepared by the UN emergency organization OCHA, attempts to put a price tag in this context. It estimates that $90 billion could protect the world's poorest 10% from the primary and secondary effects of the pandemic. It also highlights to a high cost of doing nothing on incomes, health, diet, schooling, and of course, political stability. A failure to invest in supporting this crisis now in these fragile and conflict states will have a devastating consequence down the line, whether it is an attempt to combat the growth of a terrorist group such as the Islamic State, the rise and more power that organized criminal groups can, or the flow of refugees such as we saw during the 2015 European refugee crisis. This is not to mention the risk of further peaks of COVID that will impact northern and western countries from migration from these countries in fragile and conflict states, whether it's legal or illegal migration. A phrase which I've been adopting of late is that no one is safe until everybody is safe. The point I'm really trying to make here is that there is a humanitarian rationale to support those in unfortunate situations. Millions of people are in need, and there's a moral obligation in my perspective to support these people and to provide them the aid, whether it's in cash, whether it's in humanitarian assistance for education, whether it's in sanitation. But there's also a hard, pragmatic point here. The US and European countries' security and indeed political discourse depends on early action. I just wanted to give a quick example here from 2015 and the European refugee crisis. What happened obviously was the situation with Syria, Iraq, Afghanistan results in quite a large number of people starting to flee the country across into Turkey and then into Greece and across into Europe. And this has obviously had huge implications in terms of the political discourse in these European countries, whether it's from those who feared migrants, refugees, asylum seekers, or those who wanted to welcome them. On the back of that, we've seen the rise of populism in countries such as the UK and in various Eastern European countries, and also the growth of various far-right terrorist groups who are obviously deadly against this idea of refugees, migrants, asylum seekers coming into into their countries. So what I'm trying to say from this is that there is consequences to not acting now in terms of trying to support those who are in these desperate situations. As further down the line, what we'll see is that people will start to move. There will be a growth of non-state actors, and they will fill the void which is left by the lack of support from the international community. The next point I wanted to move on to is disinformation. I wanted to address disinformation here, and I'm happy to elaborate further in the question and answer section, because it is something I've been working on now a lot around the US presidential election in terms of the COVID-19 response, and also looking at how states and non-state actors are using disinformation strategies. But within the context of my remarks, I wanted to focus on a few specific examples related to the COVID-19 crisis. We live in a time of great political polarization, and both sides of the political discourse will use spin to try and reinforce their message. But there is an unfortunate discourse which has been caught in this political volatility of our time, and this is around refugees and asylum seekers. For a long time in the US, there was a collective political agreement that the US should lead on refugee resettlement, and this was the case under both Republican and Democratic presidents. The US has, for instance, offered refuge to displaced Europeans after World War II, to Hungarians after the 1956 uprising, and to those who fled the former Soviet Union and the conflict in Kosovo in the 1990s. Refugee resettlement was a bipartisan issue, and the view of refugees itself is nothing like we see today. Refugees are not, and I quote here, rapists, terrorists, or criminals. In fact, in many cases, they are the ones who are fleeing from these issues and attempting to seek safe haven for themselves and their families. The politicization of refugees is something that has happened only in recent years. I'm happy to call it an example of disinformation. The current president in this election cycle is using advertisements on Facebook to target elderly voters with anti-migrant content. Something like over 50% of the budget that the Republican Party has allocated to Facebook advertisements is targeting those over 65 years of age. This is politics and not fact. The International Monetary Fund, and I read a CSIS report just this week, which is a large think tank in Washington, DC, all highlight the fact that refugees not only are a very low risk population in terms of crime and security issues in comparison to other segments of the population, but that they innovate and they have a distinct culture that actually can boost the economy at a time when the country is going into a great recession. In fact, if you don't believe it, here are some examples. The CEO of Uber is a refugee. The first female Secretary of State in the US was a refugee. Even Freddie Mercury of Queen was a refugee. My point is that people given the opportunity can thrive and add so much value, diversity, and innovation to their new countries. And at this time, we should be welcoming this because of our economic situation, but also because of the moral situation. We're at the start of what could be a horrific recession, and yet we're in the process of seemingly attempting to end our asylum process. And refugees could in fact help us grow our economy through their innovation. And then I think back to my conversation with a deportee from El Salvador who wanted to make money to send back to his family in El Salvador and was fleeing because of the risk to his life from criminal gangs. And I think that what he went through and what he's gone back to, and almost certainly given what the situation is like in El Salvador, given COVID-19, what he's facing today. And I think that we need to be able to fix this issue so that people like him are not in the situation that they have to flee for their lives because of security situation in their country, and obviously face horrific dangers on the route to the US, and then faced with difficulties on their asylum seeking request. So before I open up to questions and answers, I wanted to touch on a few potential policy solutions which I've been thinking about. The first thing which I feel very strongly about is that we need more coverage to highlight what is going on in these fragile and conflict countries. This in turn means more news organizations willing to show the world what is happening, whether it is in Idlib, Syria, or aid in Yemen, or the selling of migrants and asylum seekers in northern Libya. I'm currently involved in a project, as Joanna mentioned, with a technology company where we are using their image verification platform to empower citizen journalists to report on what's happening as the impact of COVID-19 impacts fragile and conflict states. We've reported on Syria, Our next report and video is on Yemen, and then we're moving to Iraq, Afghanistan, and Libya. The aim of what we're trying to achieve is to raise the voice of the voiceless and those people who are oppressed, so that the Western civilization knows what's happening. The second point I wanted to make is that the UN, World Bank, and International Monetary Fund and other international institutions need to increasingly support and provide funding upstream from crises, which is based on risk management and assessing issues such as the likelihood and impact of Covid-19, the vulnerability of populations such as those who are displaced or unemployed or ill. This is only going to be achieved if we develop a better approach to identifying those countries which are at risk, and then having the confidence in partners to run programs which has avoided issues like corruption. But the bottom line at this point is that we need an international and coordinated response to this crisis. Disinformation. If COVID is the biggest risk we have faced in my lifetime, the impact of disinformation is not far off. Whether it's the Russian government trying to deny a chemical weapons attack has happened in Syria, or a non-state actor attempting to capitalize on social media by undercutting NGOs or humanitarian actors in their efforts to provide aid, we need solutions to address this issue, and that could be in part technology, in part education, in part policy, but we also need the media to take responsibility for reporting facts and verified information, and reporting on issues which highlight the vulnerable and the voiceless. The final point I wanted to raise before I pass over to Joanna and talk about some more of these in the question and answer section is programmatic. I can't emphasize enough, having traveled to some of these countries, how important it is the population and the cultures and the languages and the customs of the people we're trying to aid are taken into account. We need to listen to what people want in these countries and these contexts. If it's that they need cash to start a new business to support themselves and their families, or if it's a program we want to implement, but looking at what else is happening in that neighborhood, we understand that it's actually going to do more harm than good. Let's make sure that the people we are working with, the beneficiaries, are the ones who are supported in this process, and then we're not doing any harm to us, to them, or to any of their families. And with that, I'll pass back over to Joanna, and we can move into hopefully a discussion around the question and answers.
Thank you so much, James, for your presentation. It's given a lot of food for thought here about the situation around the world. My first question to you is, why do you think disinformation campaigns are so successful? Especially since we are going to be facing a situation where people will not be able to travel. As you say, you have to really rely on people on the ground to provide information. So why do you think it's so successful? And what is the best way to counter it?
Yes, I think that's a good question. The unfortunate reality is that, you know, we're obviously polarized as a nation at the moment, but also in terms of world politics, what's happening, whether it's between Russia and the US, China and the US, there's, you know, great geopolitical battles taking place. And there's evidence certainly that both the Chinese and the Russians have used their various networks through the media and social media and so on to spread narratives which fit with their political aims, given the situation we're going through. You know, one of the situations, examples, which is perhaps, you know, best highlighted in the media is this disinformation campaign, which is that the US made COVID as a biological weapon, and it's been dispersed in various countries. The idea behind that is obviously to weaken the US's standing in the world, and it's primarily come from Russia, for them to benefit in terms of support. You know, the second you know, big issue in my view is just we've had this revolution going on in social media, and it's allowing states, it's allowing non-state actors to bypass the traditional route of media outlets, which have editors and people to check facts. And so you can go basically directly to an audience, and in some cases people have millions of followers, and this information can go directly to to an audience. And some people will choose to agree with this content, whether it's verified or not. Others are not in the space, or do not have the critical thinking skills that are required to evaluate the information that they're reading and acting upon. And so this is obviously having significant impacts, whether it's state-led disinformation campaigns, or whether it's something more kind of micro on the ground in various countries, and various things around humanitarian organizations being spread, that they're spreading this COVID-19 rather than being there to support the populations and so on. So it's obviously having a big impact, and it's unfortunately the generation of social media which is enabling this. In terms of solutions, I think that we're still struggling with this in the US. So obviously in countries across the world, it's going to take time. My own belief is one of the best prevention measures is education, teaching people how to use social media, teaching people the skills so that they can evaluate the credibility of the media that they're digesting. So that's one policy point. The second, I suppose, would be social media companies doing more to clamp down on this content, which their platforms are being used to spread this disinformation. That can be, eradicating their platforms from hate speech. It can be taking off content which is of disinformation around COVID-19, and it can be just tightening up on people they know who are bad actors using their platforms, so trying to get ahead of the issue itself. So those are two things. Then ultimately the third, and this comes down very much to something that is political in nature, but I do think that regulators need to regulate social media more than it is happening. One of the issues that we have in the US is the difficulties around the First Amendment, and so therefore how much restriction can be placed on social media platforms. But in other countries, France, Germany, there are models for implementing laws or passing laws which make it more difficult to spread disinformation. And I think that certain countries can probably follow those models themselves. So those would be my answers to your question.
Yes, very good. Thank you. You had mentioned non-state actors like the Islamic State, Hezbollah, and criminal gangs in Central America. Can you just explain what their strategy is, what they're providing that their governments are incapable of providing?
Yes, so one of the focal points from my brief remarks were this idea of fragile conflict states, and perhaps I should have defined it in the talking points, but it's based on the idea or the premise that the government does not have full control over the state, and therefore there are a number of actors which likely hold territory or are also influential within the state itself. So, for instance, in the example of Lebanon, Hezbollah, which is a Shia militia and political party, but it has obviously tried to take advantage of the situation because of various crises that are going on in Lebanon around currency, economic crisis, political instability, to basically spread their messages that they are stepping up where the government can't. And so they're distributing this on social media and other platforms to try and basically win the hearts and minds of the local population and position themselves as the kind of people who can provide aid where the government can't get access and so on. So they're really trying to gain credibility among their constituents and their audience. And a similar kind of strategy is pretty apparent in various Central American countries where these organized crime criminal groups are the ones who are actually, going out into the streets and with their loudspeakers, and they're, telling people to stay indoors, and they're offering aid, whether it's food, whether it's other kinds of support. And again, they're undermining the government, and they're, trying to position themselves to have more support, more recruits, more influence at a time when COVID-19 has passed. So given the number of conflicts that are going on, and given the number of fragile states and conflict states that are in the world, this is a pretty significant issue in terms of security, and then future humanitarian and refugee crises as well.
So how significant is donor fatigue for for humanitarian organizations, or for weak and fragile governments? What impact does that have, given COVID now, given the economic recession issues that a lot of the wealthier countries are facing, and then obviously their contributions to international organizations such as the UN or the WHO. So how significant is that issue?
I think it's a huge issue. Before COVID, I mentioned again in the remarks that the number of displaced people and refugees is at the highest level since World War II already. The number of crises that have been going on for so many years, like the Syria conflict's now coming up into its 10th year. The Yemen conflict, I believe, is going into its 6th year. Donors are based on the conversations and interviews I've been doing, weary. They're providing aid to these countries, and it's been going on for so long, and yet there's no kind of like end in sight in terms of these conflicts ending, or there being peace settlements or agreements. So that was already the kind of context before COVID-19, and then obviously we've been hit by this new shock, and the kind of a global emergency. People in the US, people in the UK, people in Germany, people in Europe, they're losing their jobs. Their ability to provide support to humanitarian international organizations is, likely lower today than it was 6 months ago because of the economic crisis and the recession. And so donors are obviously looking for more value in terms of supporting programs in these countries. And one of the big issues is trying to get unrestricted funding, so that in places like Yemen, where the delivery of aid is so complicated, and some humanitarian organizations that I've been speaking to, I mean, they literally cannot get humanitarian supplies into the country because of blockades of the ports and things like that. And so as a result, they're having to pay what previously they would have paid $50 for a thermometer, and the prices have now gone up to like $600 in aid and in elsewhere, simply because they can't get supplies in. So therefore, supply and demand goes up, and the prices that they have to pay are much higher. So to have a donor, you have to be able to convince them that okay, we might not be able to get these supplies in. We might have to deal with a situation where the price on the ground of these kind of essential materials that we need to kind of treat COVID is so expensive. Can you trust us to do this programming given all of these uncertainties? And you need a long-standing relationship with the donors to be able to do that. So it's a very difficult environment, and in my view, made even more difficult from the US decision to pull out, for instance, of the World Health Organization. If any time, almost in history, there was a need for an international response to a crisis which is taking place across the world, it's now. And so therefore we need, despite the problems, a strong and well-funded World Health Organization, an influential United Nations, and well-funded humanitarian organizations. And it's just a very difficult time to do that in the context.
And that really leads me to the next question. Is the absence of the US taking a leadership role, taking the traditional leadership role, has that been really missed in this crisis? how much has it been missed? I should really rephrase that. How much has it been missed?
You know, my personal view is that the US leadership is important in terms of helping deal with international crises. The most effective it can be is not by America leading without any supporters, but in terms of acting collaboratively through a network of partners, a strong Europe with Germany and France, and working in collaboration with China and Russia and the other world powers in India, and trying to deal with this in a collective manner. You know, a number of people I respect have written very powerfully about how the 2008 economic crisis was dealt with internationally, because, you know, the G7 and got around the table and they, you know, agreed collectively how they were going to respond to it, and did so in a consistent and coordinated manner. But what we're seeing now is this, you know, complete lack of action together, and it makes it very difficult for resources to get distributed in the right way, to ensure that, you know, the people who need the health supplies or the PPE equipment first are getting it in the right manner. And then obviously you know, the other issue, which I think we can all see happening, is that the likes of China are positioning themselves to kind of take the place of where the US was previously in supporting a lot of these countries. And, you know, I mentioned a little bit earlier the situation in Lebanon, where there's a political and economic crisis. And some of the analysis I've read in the past 10 days suggests that China is positioning itself to actually support the Lebanese and become a key partner for Lebanon in trying to alleviate this crisis. And that's, you know, a reality of the situation. These countries need financial, they need diplomatic, and they need humanitarian support. But then, you know, where we're going to be in a few years' time when this COVID-19 crisis is hopefully over, and you know, US influence is patchy in some of the countries perhaps that it used to have better relationships with, will have kind of longer term macro implications.
All right, thank you. We have a question from one of our members. How useful would it be were the UN agencies, its member states, and the general INGO community to revisit the 1951 Convention on Refugees with the willingness to broaden its precepts? Would a broadening of the original definition of refugee help or encourage states, assuming we believe the UN still has a modicum of influence?
That's a very good question, and, you know, I've read arguments on both sides of this, and it also has implications because various legal systems take slightly different national views on this issue as well. But, you know, I think my personal view, and this is not speaking for any organization or anyone else, is that in time we're going to have to revisit that 1951 agreement, because, you know, we're facing issues where people are fleeing things like climate issues and therefore losing their livelihoods, and also fleeing from things like food insecurity. And we have to have, in my view, a system in place that enables these people to have the opportunity of seeking asylum, because at the moment the credible fear issue does not have a kind of wide enough definition to include these types of people. There's a counter argument to that, which is that by changing the definition, will actually be reducing the value or the seriousness attached to, you know, the millions of people who are already refugees and who need assistance. And if we start widening the definition, are we really going to be able to give sufficient care and aid to these people already who are refugees? So I guess my ultimate kind of summary is I think we do need to make the term more inclusive, but also we need to ensure that the people who are already refugees need to have sufficient support, which isn't the case. So until we're in a situation where internationally and collectively we can deal with these issues and provide the support that's needed, I don't see it as a very kind of strong likelihood that the 1951 agreement will change.
All right, thank you. And here's another question from one of our members. Why aren't we hearing more about the COVID situation in countries like El Salvador right now? And where can one find more information?
It's a very good question. There was an article I read, I think at the beginning of this week, that MSF was warning that the public health system in El Salvador is literally collapsing as we speak. And my reaction was was, why are the major news organizations not covering this? I think that there are a number of explanations for this. One is that there are crises happening in the US. Someone commented on the post I made about this issue, saying like we've got a crisis in Florida at the moment. We can't deal with a country which has a smaller population than Florida and El Salvador with the coverage. But in my view, people should be treated equally, and it's on the media organizations to ensure that these areas and the vulnerable people are reported on. Again, difficulty with traveling at the moment because of COVID-19, and the concern that journalists will be spreading COVID-19 if they travel. But my answer to your specific question is, for coverage on El Salvador, for instance, you're probably going to have to go to an El Salvadorian news outlet that is covering the issue in English. And I know that the Open Society Foundations, for instance, provides financial support to El Faro, which provides, I sign up to their coverage, and once a week get an English summary of what's happening in El Salvador, which provides me a lot of the context to know what's happening. But a kind of slightly different topic from this conversation is that there needs to be a movement among the international media to ensure that the marginalized and voiceless community is increasingly covered in their coverage, whether it's BBC, CNN, New York Times, Washington Post, etc., etc.
Could you speak a little bit, James, about the situation you found in Mexico when you were there in February on the border region? What were your main takeaways? What you found the most upsetting? Was there anything positive in that situation?
The trip I had to Mexico was, when you're looking and speaking to refugees and asylum seekers, it's always upsetting. And I still remember, just recounting it now, that there was a group of about 20 Guatemalans, and this was in Tijuana on the border between San Diego and the US. And they'd just been turned away from by the US border control because and they told me their story, but basically that they were living in a part of Guatemala which was experiencing droughts, kind of run out of food, couldn't support their families, were scared to go into some of the cities because of the problem with gangs, so made the decision to kind of take this long journey up from Guatemala to the Tijuana border. And they spent obviously a lot of money getting there, and now we're in this situation where they've been turned away and they didn't have any money to get them back to Guatemala from the US border, Tijuana. So it's really upsetting when you see the people's despair, and a lot of the people, in my experience, they don't understand the asylum system. I can't say I understand the current situation of the asylum seeking situation in the US, but you know, they don't know that the situation that they're leaving from is not going to be able to get them a safe residency in the US, and this is again a little while ago that there was a situation pre-COVID where the legal representation for Central Americans trying to seek asylum in the US was completely overwhelmed. So I think I'm fair in saying that most likely these people weren't given adequate legal representation, or didn't understand the information they were getting, possibly because of language issues and so on. So that's all very sad. On the positive, I would say that you know, there are a number of really amazing people, and I've worked with some of these humanitarian organizations, and the staff setting up in these places. And Tijuana is a dangerous city, and yet, you know, these often very young humanitarians go and like they set up and they have shelters and they have like distributions of food and they're giving information and they're like providing a service which is just completely not provided by either in my view, the US government or at that time the Mexican authorities. So I mean, there is hope. There are good people, and there are people lobbying the US government to try and improve the asylum situation, which is needed. But I mean, this isn't obviously going to happen overnight. So you know, the best way forward is, again, in my view, you try and treat some of the symptoms in Guatemala, in Mexico, in El Salvador, to try and stabilize the situation and give these people opportunities to build their lives, to feed their children, to have employment, and that hopefully gives them opportunities to kind of want to stay in their country and build a life. And then for those people who are fleeing from criminal gangs and things like that, provide support humanitarian agencies who are, you know, they're really saving people's lives on these routes up to the US border in Mexico. And you know, the more funding they can get, the brand names, the big humanitarian organizations, they do, you know, such a fabulous job, and I admire these people and their courage and, you know, what they're doing for humanity.
Thank you. We have another question from one of our members. I am a graduate of West Point and a veteran of both the Cold War in Germany and multiple terrorist attacks there, where I saw Russian disinformation and subversion up close, and also the Gulf War. What role do you think people and our cultures have in this fight with disinformation? Many tend to believe the worst about things as a predisposition. Think of the pervasiveness of gossip and such.
Yeah, well, that's a very good question, and I'm glad that your member highlighted the fact that this disinformation isn't new, and that the Soviet Union was obviously using it pervasively during the Cold War. You know, it's very difficult to answer these questions, but my personal view is that building self-resilience, whether it's in a small community or whether it's in a larger town or city, and that comes from you know, giving people accurate information as to what's happening, and that can come from, for instance, a religious leader. In some parts of the world, the church is incredibly influential in terms of what's going on. So I believe that these influential people, whether it's a church, a religious elder, a community leader, they have a responsibility to provide their local communities with factual, verified information, and that obviously then puts the burden onto humanitarian organizations to do things to provide accurate information, and so that people know what's going on. Local media can be improved in terms of training, in terms of providing them with the tools that they need to verify information. the kind of financing, so they have fact checkers who can mean that the information is reliable, that they're reading. But obviously, and this is a big problem, a number of countries, particularly fragile and conflict states, do not have a free media. So, you know, it really comes down to the ability of those on the ground supporting in these contexts, providing information which is reliable and verified, and attempting to kind of counter disinformation. And I think there's a definite synergy between countering disinformation and countering kind of terrorist narratives and things like that. Like, if you look at the kind of underlying issues on both of these kind of broad topics, you know, one of the key strategies is educating people better to know about what information is being given to them, so that they have the agency to be able to act upon it themselves. But I mean, this disinformation situation is only, in my view, going to get worse in the coming years, because you just have so many actors looking to provide their own version of events. Like RT, the Russian network, which is connected to the Russian government, has a huge number of outlets now across the world, in Libya, in various sub-Saharan African countries. And you know, I was speaking to someone, and she told me she's been reporting on the Russian issues for some time, and she told me RT in many ways now is just the voice of Putin. So it's spreading things such as homophobia, racist comments and things like that. And you know, people who are reading RT in Libya or elsewhere, they're kind of facing this information. So this isn't a problem that's going to be combated anytime soon. And I think the best strategy that we can do is to try and support kind of education and awareness and things like that.
All right, thank you. From another of our members, are there as yet any projections for new refugee flows as a result of COVID and its effects? Is the UNHCR system positioned in capacity and/or location to handle such new flows?
I haven't seen myself any projections or estimates of what is likely to happen. You know, in the short term, my sense is that the movement, certainly between countries, will be less than it has been, because so many countries have kind of closed their borders to stop people getting through. But you know, as we move past this, and probably early next year, mid next year, when a vaccination starts to become available, you know, I suspect we'll see much more movement of people. That's my own assessment. And obviously, if you look at a country, Zimbabwe perhaps as an example, which is going through a terrible economic kind of catastrophe as a result of the kind of COVID restrictions, there's going to be movement into neighboring countries. And I think we'll probably see a lot of countries which were not previously kind of large producers of refugees increasingly becoming so, unless we can, you know, as I said, get ahead of this and provide kind of, you know, upfront aid and support to these countries where these crises are likely to take place. So, you know, I don't know what the 2021 UN refugee and displaced persons number will be, but I do think in the short term there'll be more people displaced internally, so within countries, rather than moving as refugees. But then the refugee number will probably pick up as borders open and as restrictions are lifted.
And then here's another question. You had mentioned during discussion about the U.S. role and how it has stepped back. Is there any hope for an international response coordinated by another country, for example, France or Germany, at least with respect to the conflicts in Africa and the Middle East that directly affects them?
Yeah, I think that's a very good question, and you know, one of the things I certainly would highlight is that the French are doing fantastic work in the Sahel and West Africa at the moment in terms of providing kind of counterinsurgency and also counter-violent extremism efforts there, and you know, they have military involved. They have been taking a lead in terms of trying to coordinate what's happening there and try and kind of mitigate the situation as much as they can. But the French cannot do it alone. And you know, one of the things I increasingly see likely happening kind of at a geopolitical level is state actors having to work with humanitarian organizations, the UN, and even kind of groups of mayoral leadership to try and deal with these situations together. So as where in the past you would perhaps have the US, France, the UK, Germany, and a number of other countries all supporting a particular cause together, I think increasingly you're going to see perhaps one state, whether it's France, in the case of the Sahel, working with mayors, working with humanitarian organizations and international institutions like the IMF and the World Bank, and really kind of taking a lead in a particular area and hopefully boosting the capacity. That's just the way that the world is happening, and the way the world is evolving. I think there obviously needs to be, in my view, more leadership from Europe and other Western countries in places like Syria and Yemen. But you know, that's a battle which is really for another day, because there's just so many complex issues around arms companies supplying weapons and so on and so forth, that it becomes an economic issue versus a human rights and a kind of peace building exercise. So there are difficulties, but you know, I'm optimistic that in the years to come we'll learn kind of new ways to deal with these problems, which are with new coalitions and less of the kind of old day state structure.
All right, and this will be our last question to you, James, from our members. As it is unlikely to hope for the United States, Congress, the US President, or social media platforms and news organizations to regulate themselves, are there any data to indicate that populations are inoculating themselves to disinformation, or are we just doomed to keep playing whack-a-mole with dangerous propaganda?
Yes, I have to watch what I say to this one. I think I'll probably get sued by Twitter or Facebook. Look, my personal view is that progress, I'll use the US as an example here, progress has been made since 2016 by various different bodies. There's better education being provided by various think tanks, various nonprofits in the US in terms of providing the younger generation with skills that they need as to whether or not they should retweet something, whether they should look at content suspiciously, or whether they should alert someone to it. I do think that is changing as a kind of younger generational issue, and I think that there's an improvement there. I also think, to give them their credit, social media companies have you know, made some progress in terms of ensuring that they respond more quickly to hate and disinformation which is on their platforms. You know, Facebook, for instance, has invested a huge amount of money in building an electoral response team, so that the 72 hours before an election takes place, you know, they have people patrolling what's going on to ensure that people respond and get the disinformation off their platforms as soon as possible. But here's the possibly sad reality of the situation. I think that ultimately the biggest pressure can come from the advertisers who use these platforms to advertise their messages. And what we saw in the last few weeks is, you know, a number of very large multinational companies, including Coca-Cola and Unilever, coming together and like coordinating a boycott of Facebook's platform until they did more to kind of police and prevent hate speech, disinformation on their platform. And as is the case with many powerful institutions, it's only when the financial cost starts hitting them that they will be forced into action. So in terms of a policy advocacy strategy, perhaps, on this issue going forward, I think it's a case of pressurizing also the likes of Coca-Cola, the likes of Unilever, and other large organizations which spend a lot of money on Facebook advertisements to ensure that Facebook's doing more to, and social media generally, to try and combat disinformation.
Well, thank you, James. On behalf of the World Affairs Forum, our members, myself and Wendy, thank you so much for giving us such a significant overview of humanitarian issues and disinformation, you know, prior to COVID and during COVID. And I really appreciate you taking the time. I know that we enjoyed all that you had to relay to us. And I thank you again.
Thanks very much for hosting us and for all the work you're doing. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Goodbye, everyone.